The confrontation happened at an exclusive charity gala in Monaco, where Europe's most influential celebrities, athletes, and business leaders had gathered to raise money for children's education initiatives. But what should have been an evening focused on philanthropy and positive social impact became something entirely different when British comedian James Mitchell, who was serving as the event's host, began incorporating what he clearly thought were harmless jokes about Muslims into his routine between auction items and donor recognition speeches. The jokes started subtly with references to prayer times and dietary restrictions that got polite chuckles from some audience members, but gradually became more pointed and offensive as Mitchell seemed to gain confidence from what he interpreted as audience approval. Though many guests were actually becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the direction his commentary was taking. Ronaldo, who was seated at a prominent table near the stage with other football stars and entertainment figures, initially tried to ignore the jokes, hoping they would stop. But as Mitchell's comments became more explicitly prejudiced, including stereotypes about Muslim women, terrorism, and cultural practices that had nothing to do with reality and everything to do with harmful misconceptions that fuel discrimination and violence against Muslim communities around the world, Ronaldo found himself growing angrier with each passing minute. The breaking point came when Mitchell made a joke about Muslim players during Ramadan, suggesting that they were weak and distracted during the holy month, and that teams should avoid signing Muslim athletes during that time because their religious obligations made them unreliable competitors. This comment was not only factually incorrect, but deeply insulting to the many Muslim athletes who had proven their dedication and excellence while maintaining their faith. And it was also a personal attack on several of Ronaldo's teammates and friends, including Benzema, who had been like a brother to him for years, and whose character and professionalism Mitchell was casually mocking for cheap laughs. Instead of waiting for the appropriate moment or handling this through private channels, Ronaldo stood up from his table, walked directly to the stage, and took the microphone from Mitchell's hands while the entire room of 500 guests fell into stunned silence because they had never seen anything like this happen at such a formal, high-profile event. The security team started moving toward the stage, but Ronaldo raised his hand to stop them and began speaking in a voice that was calm but carried an unmistakable authority and moral conviction that immediately commanded everyone's attention. "I need to say something because I cannot sit here and listen to this anymore," he began, looking directly at Mitchell, who was standing awkwardly beside him, clearly unprepared for this kind of public confrontation. "What you are doing up here is not comedy. It is prejudice disguised as entertainment, and it is exactly the kind of ignorance that creates division and hatred in our world." He turned to address the entire audience, many of whom were squirming uncomfortably in their seats, because they realized they had been complicit in normalizing these harmful stereotypes by remaining silent and even laughing at jokes that dehumanized an entire religious community. "I have played football with Muslim teammates for my entire career, and they are some of the most dedicated, disciplined, and honorable people I have ever known. They fast during Ramadan and still outperform players who have no such commitments. They pray 5 times a day and still train harder than anyone else. They follow their faith and still show up for their teammates, their fans, and their communities with more consistency and integrity than most people in this room." The silence in the ballroom was deafening as Ronaldo continued his impromptu speech that was being recorded by multiple phones and would soon be shared millions of times across social media platforms. But more than that, these jokes you think are harmless. They hurt real people. They reinforce stereotypes that lead to discrimination in employment, housing, education. They make Muslim children feel ashamed of their heritage. They make Muslim families feel unsafe in their own communities. And they give permission to people who harbor real hatred to believe that their prejudice is socially acceptable. He looked directly at Mitchell again, whose face had gone pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake and the potential consequences for his career. "When you make jokes about Muslims being terrorists or oppressive or backwards, You are not just insulting a religion, you are attacking the humanity of nearly 2 billion people, including many of the people who work in your industry, who buy tickets to your shows, who consider you an entertainer they respect, and who deserve better than to be the punchline of your ignorance. Ronaldo paused, letting his words sink in before delivering what would become the most quoted part of his speech. I want everyone in this room to think about the Muslim doctors who have saved your lives, the Muslim teachers who have educated your children, the Muslim engineers who have built the buildings you live and work in, the Muslim artists who have created beauty that has moved you, and ask yourselves whether those people deserve to be reduced to the cruel stereotypes that pass for humor in some circles. The applause that followed was not the polite golf clap typical of such events, but a sustained standing ovation that seemed to come from a collective recognition that something important had just happened, that a line had been drawn between acceptable discourse and harmful prejudice, and that one of the most famous people in the world had used his platform not to stay safely neutral, but to defend people who were often voiceless in rooms like this. Mitchell attempted to regain control of the situation by approaching the microphone with what appeared to be an apology, but Ronaldo was not finished. "Before you say anything," he told Mitchell, "I want you to understand that this is not about political correctness or sensitivity. This is about basic human decency and respect. If you want to make jokes, make them about yourself, about your own flaws and struggles, not about other people's faith or heritage or identity, especially when those jokes contribute to real-world harm against vulnerable communities." The aftermath of Ronaldo's intervention was immediate and far-reaching. Mitchell's attempt at an apology fell flat because it focused more on defending his intentions than acknowledging the impact of his words, and several major venues canceled his upcoming shows, while comedy clubs and television producers distanced themselves from his brand of humor that had suddenly become recognized as unacceptably harmful rather than edgy or provocative. But the more significant impact was the conversation that Ronaldo's speech sparked about the responsibility that entertainers and public figures have to consider how their words affect marginalized communities, and whether comedy that punches down at people who are already facing discrimination and violence can ever be justified by claims of artistic freedom or the need to push boundaries. The video of Ronaldo's speech became a teaching tool in diversity and inclusion workshops around the world, and was cited by Muslim advocacy organizations as an example of effective allyship that goes beyond symbolic gestures to actually confronting prejudice when it occurs, even at personal and professional cost. Several other celebrities who had remained silent during Mitchell's routine publicly apologized for their inaction and committed to speaking up in similar situations because they realized that silence in the face of bigotry was a form of complicity that enabled harmful attitudes to persist and spread. Mitchell eventually issued a more substantive apology, acknowledging that his jokes had been rooted in harmful stereotypes, and announcing that he would be working with Muslim community organizations to better understand the real-world consequences of anti-Muslim prejudice and to develop comedy that brought people together rather than dividing them based on ignorance and fear. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Muslim athletes around the world who thanked Ronaldo for defending their dignity and humanity at a moment when it would have been easier for him to remain silent and avoid controversy that could have affected his endorsement deals or his relationships with other celebrities who might have preferred that such issues remain unaddressed. The incident became a turning point in how entertainment industry events handled potentially offensive content, with many organizations implementing guidelines that required comedians and hosts to avoid material that targeted religious, ethnic, or cultural groups in ways that reinforced harmful stereotypes or contributed to real-world discrimination against vulnerable communities. Years later, when asked about the Monaco incident, Ronaldo said that he considered it one of the most important moments of his career, not because of any football achievement, but because it represented his commitment to using his platform to defend people who deserved respect and dignity, regardless of their faith, background, or identity. And because it demonstrated that true leadership, sometimes requires the courage to interrupt comfortable situations and force difficult conversations that ultimately make society more just and inclusive.